first ever CX Talks chat. And this is CX Talk sessions. We're planning on having these on a weekly basis. My name is Mark Michelson. I am the producer of CX Talks. We're used to meeting in person, but while we can't meet in person, we're going to be meeting online. And today, I'm pleased to present a lively discussion between Diane Majors, who is the founder of Experience Catalysts, and Phillip Keiken, who is with Farm Credit Services and is the VP of User Experience. So without much more ado, Diane and Phillip, I turn it over to you.
Well, hey, thanks, Mark. I'm delighted to be here, and Phillip and I have spent quite a bit of time talking about this topic, and I think he's got some brilliant things to share with you today. High-level overview, we're going to talk a little bit about expanding the definition of design, design and value, how those two things go hand in hand, and then how do we get the organization to really understand what the role is of design within the organization and what it brings. So, Phillip, I'm going to start off with kind of the whole, okay, what is it that we're talking about? Let's define experience design. What is it actually?
It's quite a lofty question. So what is experience design? I think this is one of those things where, a lot of people think about, UX or CX or GX or EX, and there's kind of a different definition or different perspective across the board. But, outside of the broad, holistic kind of cross-channel touch points, I think when we talk about experience design, it's really, what that interaction is between a customer and everything to do with the company. So how do we create value for a customer? How do we, build a brand? How do we understand that experience design is extremely important? And I think to do that, it's understanding the what isn't experience design. And, experience design, a lot of people think of, this culmination of artifacts created during a design process, things like wireframes or visual concepts, but it's a much bigger picture than that. It's truly looking at a relationship, a two-way channel, every touch point, every communication, every interaction that someone might have with an organization. So, it's really touching on that human experience rather than the customer experience, digital experience, user experience.
So it's really more of a mindset than the actual artifacts and activities around it. And it touches every experience regardless of where it is. It can be applied in many different ways.
Yeah, it's really an underlying culture in essence. It's a philosophy an organization has. And it's really looking at it that way when you start to understand how do I meet the need of an overall customer? How do I become customer centric?
So you talk a little bit about customer centric. Let's talk a little bit about the human. Many organizations are kind of, finding and fixing or even trying to innovate around this human experience. Can you talk a little bit about why changing an experience isn't really designing it?
Sure. I kind of, when I think about this, how is changing an experience a little different than designing an experience? I really feel there's more than just a little difference. It's truly kind of, as I would look at it, as a chasm. If you can repair an interaction or repair an experience, but it's very different than designing an intentional relationship. So really looking at what are we trying to create for a customer? And I like to equate it to, and I don't know if others will understand this, but, I've spent, my due time doing this, but it's kind of like, going to therapy for an hour versus having a therapeutic relationship. It's not this, I'm going to go to, or even I'm going to go to a chiropractor for, one session and then I'll be fine. It's truly this ongoing relationship, this ability to really focus on a customer and really get deep with that customer. And so, it's not a branding activity. It's not something that, you fix or pretend to innovate against. It's truly a foundational culture. And understanding those desires and problems of a user, understanding how you can innovate and disrupt through every action, every decision, everything that's customer focused or customer first.
Well, that seems pretty straightforward, but when I think about what the topics that we've discussing this for quite some time, and the idea of this divide, this design divide, let's kind of define that for the audience.
Sure. And, I think many have probably experienced this, but, if we paint a picture, there's obviously user experience or UX, as a lot of people would look at it, which is kind of this cross-functional capability. And then, as I mentioned before, there's kind of customer experience and digital experience, and there's all these terms and, approaches that are looked at in organizations. And the picture I like to paint when we talk about that experience design divide is really, let's pretend you walked into a meeting and, you're in that meeting and you're part of the UX team, let's say, and all of a sudden you hear the words from the product manager, "We already talked to users." Those famous words, and you're kind of like, what? Well, as this is going on, CX is running surveys with customers as part of their voice of the customer initiatives. Digital experience is looking at analytics and user paths and usage of customers. Marketing is conducting focus groups and looking at, voice and tone and style and branding components. And then UX might have just found out that this is going on in terms of what's happening in an organization. So you're kind of left wondering, what happened, why? And at the heart of it, it's really who's accountable for owning the experience of the customer. There's all these independent efforts, there's these silos, who's identifying patterns, who's conducting analysis, who's synthesizing research, in essence, who's orchestrating the cross-enterprise effort. And what you find in many organizations is nobody. There's all of these different independent silos, these entities. It all happens with fragmented information. And I think most organizations have good intentions in terms of having a CX department, which should really be cross-functional, or having a UX department or an innovation group or these different entities. But that's really an example of the experience design divide. It's these silos and fragmentation information areas that aren't seeing one another and how they can work together.
Well, everybody's got their own perspective. I always say everybody likes their silo because they're comfortable there. So how do we get people to really expand that definition of what they do and be more collaborative and working across the journey and taking each perspective for the uniqueness that it brings and molding them together? How do you approach that, and what recommendations do you have?
Well, that's a lot easier said than done. So let me think about some of those recommendations as we talk here. I think the very first thing that an organization needs to do is create a definition, some type of common language about what they mean by these different, UX, DX, CX, these different areas of expertise or business units as they may look at it. And this really, these terms are more than just language. It's really understanding how an organization perceives experience design. And I think that perception is really where, there's that current state of how it's understood. There's the gaps of knowledge, there's mindsets of leadership. And that's really when you start to look at those things, that's how you start to mature an organization and mature a company. And so when we look at how do we kind of define these different areas and collaborate and extend and bring those together, some of the key things you need to do first are really understand how your organization is structured. I think that's one of those things after you get kind of the I guess, consistency of what things are. And then how do you, that structure enable you to meet the customer where, when, and how they desire. So once again, going back to that idea of a philosophy or a culture, it's really looking at it and saying, what is it that I need to do for the customer? Not just what I think I need to do by looking inside my organization, but actually meeting with customers, talking with customers, learning from customers, and being able to take those insights and say, how do I do what they need me to do? How do I solve their problems and needs? Not necessarily looking internally and saying, this is what I think my customer wants. And I think the other piece is, really looking at how the company can achieve that alignment and adoption. So if everyone's customer centric and it's really, that's the philosophy, then it's kind of looking back at it and saying, based on this, based on the organization starting to change their philosophy and their perspective and their kind of chain of looking at those different areas, how do we create that alignment and adoption? And I think those are some of the core things that need to happen.
I think that's great to say. You really have to define what it is you're trying to accomplish and the terms, and take a look at the tools that you use across the organization making sure that you're sharing those. I find a lot of organizations who have different design standards across the organization in their silos, and that doesn't help. We're not leveraging the strength of the organization. It seems like you're talking about there's a lot of tools, but really it's the toolbox we need to be talking about, how that's used coherently and consistently across the organization. That's great. So, well, to do that, I think it's important that we have to kind of demonstrate the importance and the impact of design. Many times people say, oh, I'm building a product, I don't have time to go do design. Doesn't make any sense, I have to get it out the door. Can you share more about how we really begin to tie the importance and the impact to design?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about design, I think you hit it on the head. A lot of people look at it as, well, we don't have time for it, or, we have a certain timeline we need to hit. We have to execute on this and complete the next initiative for a project, or look at our product roadmap and knock out the next set of features. And, it's really about, whether you look at product management or user experience or customer experience, all those different terms. When we look at experience design, it's really about the outcomes we're looking for and not the output. And I think a lot of people look at the artifacts and the output that comes from a design process or a design function. And we really need to look at, how we're making an impact from a relationship between what I'll call tying good design to overall business results. And creating that connection or that linkage is really the business outcome. And so, I'll kind of paint a picture of a story in terms of, how I envision demonstrating the importance of impact in design. And I think it comes back to, once again, talking in business terms, being able to talk to executive leadership and help them understand it's not how pretty something is, or, how the tone or voice or style is communicated, or, it's really looking at it and saying, how do I make that impact? And so, one example of a program I worked with an organization on was a product for their sales desk. And when we talk about customer experience, or that holistic view, there's a lot of things that need to happen to, do things like make their approach more efficient when they're working with customers, or be able to serve a customer with, how quickly they get orders or how they receive things. And, in this particular sense, there was this whole idea of how an organization can deliver quotes quickly and then deliver product quickly. And the real problem with the customer at the time was, how do I know what my order was after I place it? Why is there a latency in me understanding what it is? And in working with the organization, we had product owners and business owners that kind of came out with this communication of, well, we know our user, we know our customer because we used to be on the front line from a sales perspective. And I think that's one of the first, I guess, concerns or issues that arise when we talk about the importance or impact of design, is that whole customer research piece of not assuming you know your customer, but actually digging in and starting to really understand what their needs, motivations, desires are. And by doing that, it became very clear we needed to show the value of what design and research and other activities can do for an overall program. And we also started looking at how much limited assessment there was of kind of that time cost of existing processes and labor effort. And so with the lack of metrics and the lack of understanding the customers fully, you're basically set up for a really difficult situation and really putting yourself in a bad spot. And so that's really where, with this organization, we made the recommendation to go in and, let's spend a little bit of time validating what you say about customers. Let's talk a little bit about, the opportunity to shadow some of these customers, shadow some of the internal sales people and how they interact with these customers, and start to identify where there's gaps and problems. And, what's funny about this is when we talk about the fact of an order coming in from a customer, in this case, it was, via phone, they would call in, they would place their order, a sales rep would go ahead and, do the entry to get that into the system. Then they would go ahead and get their information back in terms of their order validation, all the typical things you'll see in a sales funnel. But what we found was a lot of those business owners painted this picture of, our sales reps hop on the phone, they're typing in a data entry application while they're on the phone with a customer. They immediately submit that, and, it goes to fulfillment. Fulfillment passes it through and, make sure we have the inventory and ships it, and kind of defined it as this very streamlined process and approach to work with a customer, which was great. So we started meeting with the sales force and started talking with customers. And what we found was that wasn't the exact picture. It was really a picture of the sales team would take a call. That customer would describe their order. The sales team would write it all in a notebook. They would use manual parts, catalogs to try and find what was being talked about. They had limited information at their disposal. And then once they did that, they would hang up with the customer and have to go back and then enter in a system, do all the parts lookups, be able to map whether it's in the warehouses for inventory. And all of this was manual behavior behind the scenes, which was delaying someone from getting their order confirmation. And so it really was that opportunity to look at it and say, how do we assess both the salespeople's productivity and how we can, increase the speed of the order confirmation for the customer, reduce the linear time frame for the order to the shipment, and all of that kind of derived from that customer research, which is really the heart of experience design. So that's really when we talk about impact, it's a lot more than just, is the development team moving at the right speed? Are we looking at our product roadmap and knocking out functionality and features? And it really comes down to, do we understand at the heart of it what a customer needs and how we can change pieces of the organization to meet that customer where they are?
Yeah, I'll share an example too when we think about connecting that, because I don't think sometimes people think that design is all at the front end. And when actually we think about applying design to what business value we're creating. So an example of that, in one company I worked with, we had a product team that really wanted to adopt design thinking, but they weren't sure of the benefits. They knew that there was, of course we want to be customer centered and really understand their needs, but they couldn't see how that was going to impact really the development of the product and the outcome. And so when we began to talk about meeting those needs and building the product, we started to recognize that we could start to talk about things like better adoption and better efficiency for the customer and the value that created, better efficiency internally. By designing the entire journey outside of those silos we talked about, that we were able to start connecting additive business value. In other words, we designed a way for the customer service team and the support teams and the customer success teams to circle back to the product team almost immediately and provide feedback about a feature, opportunity, issue that the customers were having, not just for hypercare, but also on an ongoing basis. So thinking about designing what's happening internally as well and how to optimize that for all the employees is kind of the other side of the story. And then adding all of those things up to say quicker time to market, better adoption, better efficiencies internally, rapid product improvements, all those things that organizations, especially executives, talk about with agility, collaboration, and innovation. So bringing those to life with design. And I think once you change that language in an organization, people begin to understand the power of design, both internally to the organization and externally. So I think we want to talk a little bit about, all right, so we've shared a lot of stories. We have some approaches for where you can begin to really define, to think about how you're going to bring silos together. But how should we really think about that maturity, and what does that look like? What are some examples of beginning, the middle, and what's good look like?
Yeah, I think, obviously good is pretty subjective, but, if we want to talk about maturity and how an organization shifts and changes, you hit on a point that I think is, really resonates, which is customer centricity. And the fact that, when you look inside at the business value that it generates, you also need to look at some of the things around operations and what it means for the business to deliver for the customer. And when we look at maturity, I think there's a lot of things that go with that in terms of being customer centric. And I like to look at it with the old principle, crawl, walk, run. And in terms of actually the how do I start the design process within my organization? How do I really start to make things about experience, and really be customer centric and break down those silos? I think the first part is kind of the crawl. And we talked about it a little earlier. What do I need to do to communicate the value of experience design? How do I become, a design evangelist, so to speak? And then how do I start to institute some of the practices that were talked about in terms of not just execution of delivery and product, but also how do I start to institute the practices for creating a cadence of customer feedback, creating that cadence of user research and interviews and inquiry. And I really think that's the crawl and kind of the first step. The next step, I would say, is the walk. And, when we talk about that walk, after you start that evangelism, and that obviously continues, forever, you're constantly, showing what the value of design is and what the value of an experience and customer centric approach is. But when you start to walk, you're really looking at it and saying, all right, how do I now start to establish metrics? Or how do I start to impact the philosophy and culture of the company through establishing some of that cadence that we talked about? And so once that cadence is in place and those metrics are in place and you kind of set up that foundation, that's when you can really kind of spread your wings and start to fly, start to run. And that's really when you start building success stories, but not just a case study where, you could say, hey, we delivered this or we accomplished this, but really success stories that align to that business value, and how business value can equal a strong experience design. And so by setting up those metrics in the walk, you then have the ability to map those in the run and really look at how you can have executive leadership perceive design and see design as a strategic differentiator for the organization. And that's really the power of mature design within an organization.
Yeah, where you're headed to go. I'll give an example of how we moved an organization forward I worked in. We actually we wanted people to kind of learn, try, apply, right? We wanted them to learn what the concepts were and kind of try them on and see the value themselves. So in addition to having these mini labs where we'd have people come in and kind of learn about the processes, we actually applied design to our meetings and used design thinking techniques like insight, what, why, how laddering, or a victory circle, or a brainstorming, future state storyboards, because it really helped in the meetings to make the meetings more efficient and effective. And people started to recognize that these were tools that could help them achieve what they were after quicker and much more rich than what it would have been had they just sat and kind of walked through an agenda like they typically do. So we picked something internally that we could apply it to give people, this is what it looks like. And this is some skills that they could begin to learn and apply in their daily work, so that it gradually just became part of their DNA, and they started to approach their projects and their product development or writing scripts, whatever they were doing, they started to use these techniques. So it was a little bit of sprinkling that, what I call experience dust, wherever we could, but apply to something that was really a pain point for the organization. So if you're wanting to kind of crawl and really get a start, it's a great way to just kind of embed it into something that already needs a lot of help, which we all know we've been in meetings that have needed a lot of help. Anything else on that topic?
No, I think you said it perfectly. And I think being able to institute some, kind of the practice what you preach, being able to institute some of that internally and look at how that culture and philosophy can really move you forward to that mature experience design. You're right on.
Yeah. All right. So we are, I think if we think about where people are, it's like, I may have been dabbling in some of this. I might have, several silos of design thinking. And I think there's some definite tips and tricks that we could share. So I'll share one. If you think about this topic of, ready, set, go, and you've got different organizations doing design, one thing I know in many organizations, they have a design guilds, they call it, and it's simply getting all of the people who have the skill sets together to begin to understand what are standards across all of those designs. Is there a common toolkit? Are you optimizing the knowledge and competencies of those who have been doing it a while versus those who are just getting started? So I think there's kind of creating that community within your organization that can be helpful. Philip, do you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, we always looked at it as, it seems kind of silly, talking about it as a task force, but really kind of this brain trust where if there are these business units or divides that are doing some similar functions and really have the same mission, that same North Light they're following, how do we build that brain trust of keep people to see the alignment, to see what the value is and really start to work together? So that overall collaboration and understanding that everyone has the same mission and vision. It's not separate business units. It's not separate P&Ls. It's truly, how do we deliver for the customer? And if that's ingrained in the backbone of the organization and really part of the culture, I mean, that's really where it needs to go.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, so we just wanted to share a couple things that we've done to kind of move an organization along, and we've got about 5 minutes left, which isn't a lot. So we've got a couple of questions. So let me pose these, Philip, and one I'll answer because I brought it up. We'll do that first. Marcus asked, elaborate on the victory circle. So victory circle is a really simple technique, and while it might sound simple, it's a great way for people to start and really have an idea of what are you after? Like, what are you really trying to accomplish? So it's a simple technique of just drawing a big circle with a line down the middle and thinking about functional and emotional. So put function across the top on one side and emotional across the other. And the question there is, what do we want the experience to be like in, say, 2 years? So what are we really after? What does success look like? What do people need to be able to do? And how do we want them to feel when we're done designing this particular experience? It really level sets everyone and gets agreement on checking back to say, as we design this, are we going back to what we said victory looked like for this experience? And that might have come from customer feedback. It might have come from the interviews. It may be the people in the room who are saying, this is victory for me, but it gives you a good place to actually have something out there on the horizon that you can kind of ping back and forth on. The next question that we have, and Philip, we can probably both answer this for Gary. He says, how do we use dash experience, which is a great way to put it, to get ahead of our customers and meet needs they don't realize in the present? The process sometimes takes so long we end up in the same place as others, behind the curve or at par. Can we talk about that a bit, and how can we use it to design the future? Seems even more important in our current world, where we're going to have to come out of this at many organizations much stronger and leapfrogging beyond where we were today. So I'll let you start, Philip.
Sure. You know, as I read this question, one of the things it reminds me of that I think gets interpreted in many different ways is that quote from Henry Ford, where it's, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And it's really looking at it as, what is that process? How do we not, if we talk about getting ahead of our customers and meeting their needs and they don't realize they have them, how do we learn from our customers and start to make assumptions before we talk to them, to then validate and invalidate those assumptions during customer research? So this is something that doesn't need to be a 3 or 6 or 9 month process. It's really a cadence of continual interaction and two-way communication with a customer. And by doing that, we start to understand the intent they have. We start to understand their desires and motivations. We don't rely on them for the what you need. We rely on them for the why they need it. And that really gives us an opportunity to then look at it and say, what are the things they may not be thinking of that we believe from all of the research we're doing, secondary research, the expertise and innovation, how do we deliver on what that future holds, and how do we design for the future and not for the current present?
And that's a great example of, you think about Uber. They didn't really start out to disrupt the taxi industry, although that was one of their plays. They realized that there were unmet needs in the marketplace, and they set out to design for those unmet needs. So I want to know where my car is. I don't want to have to whip out my credit card. I want to, be very easy. I want to know the person that I'm in the car with. I want it to be clean and more personal than it is today in a taxi. So they took those unmet needs and kind of built around that. Another example I would give of this is, when you're designing, having all that great information about the needs that customers have, future state storyboarding can help you get to that point. So it's literally doing what Disney would do with a movie, and kind of, what's that future look like? Let's tell that story and draw it out so people understand it. And we can really see, if this comes to life, what is it going to do for us? The other technique is called brainstorming. And I use this as a way to say, if think about all the great ideas that you have around what we could do. It's a great way to start, but to take off the reins and say, if time, money, and effort were no object, what would we do? And invariably, people come up with crazy ideas, but those crazy ideas sometimes are the one that really tip us over that pivot point to say, well, we can't do that, but we could do this. And does that meet a need that the marketplace is not there today? So it kind of gets people really thinking farther in the future and the art of the possible, I call it, and then bringing it back to that, here's what we can do reality. It gets people out of that mold of just the way we've always been thinking. And there's many tools in a design toolkit that can do that, but that's one that I love because it allows people to kind of think beyond where they are. We have one more question, and we're at time, but if you want to take a quick glance at that, Philip, and
Sure. Yeah, and just to,
answer.
it's any tools or methodologies you suggest to help keep departments like user experience research and market research working together instead of being in competition with each other. And that's an awesome question. There's so many times that you have market research doing their thing, and an experience research team doing theirs, and that competition that exists. And what I've found is, once again, outside of just let's collaborate and talk and it'll all work out, is really looking at what are some of the differences between how people view experience research and how they view market research. And in many cases, experience research is really driving into the motivations and desires and emotions of potential customers and really digging into that qualitative piece of things. And in many cases, market research is doing some similar things, but more from the quant side. We're doing things like surveys or focus groups. And so I think by bridging those gaps and really looking at what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and putting things together like, opportunity trees, or looking at a real outcome versus what are the outputs from this, and really sharing that data and insight with each other. That some of those are the things that, understanding those differences and then participating in it. I was with an organization recently and consulting with them. And one of the things we tried was actually including folks from the market research team in experience interviews, and vice versa, having experienced researchers engage with the market research team, and really doing that. I don't want to call it shadowing because everyone was participating fully, but really doing that mixed team and kind of looking at how do we become one, even if we're separate pieces within an organization.
That's a great example. So we're almost at time. I'll just weigh in and just ditto on what you said, Philip, of how you think about these things really build off of each other. And that ability for us to have that common language that Philip talked about at the beginning, where I've started to use experience-led brands, so that people begin to think experience is a lot of things. It's the experience of the brand in the market. It's the experience of the digital use, which is UX. It's how the employee gets their work done and how they feel about the brand. So whatever it is, it sometimes goes back to that language of where we're headed. And it's also, I think, important to think about methodologies and tools really need to be in a centralized place. I know a lot of times when I go to UX teams, they're not even thinking about what other information outside of what they're doing can be impactful, like going to the care center and looking at the results of, what's coming in about this particular app that we have now, and where do we need to make changes that customers are literally telling us what's missing from what we have. So I think opening that up and helping people get a view to all of the pieces of information and customer needs across the organization can build those dots and create better value and be more collaborative, which are all the things we kind of talked about today. So Philip, I want to thank you so much for being a part of our session today, and Mark for hosting us and talking about something we're obviously a little bit passionate about. There will be more of these coming, and I'm going to let Mark just share a little bit about the plan for that and where CX Talks is headed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Diane and Philip, for our inaugural CX Talks session. We're planning to do these weekly, and we're looking for speakers. We're looking for topics that are relevant. And we're also going to have some informal chat sessions and just get-togethers along the way. I'll keep everyone posted on that. There will be a recording of this available for everyone. We're looking to archive these so that you will be able to, at some point, go in there and find answers to different questions you may have along the way. I appreciate everyone being a part of the CX Talks community, and we look forward to being able to serve the CX community worldwide as we continue to broadcast out on the web. So thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate everyone's help. And this has been a terrific learning experience for me personally. And I look forward to improving every time we do this. So thank you much, everyone. Any other thoughts or questions? Other than that, we're gonna end it. We're 2:05, so 5 minutes over, and we're looking at these short things. We do have a survey going on. The survey responses have been fantastic. If you see the invite for the survey, if you would like an invite for the survey, contact me. We're giving away a $50 gift card, and we are about 75 people. Chances are pretty good right now. Giving it away on Friday at noon. So answer our survey and get in touch anytime. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again, Diane and Phillip, for a wonderful discussion and very helpful today. Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye.